You're listening to How to Stan, the podcast all about both specific fandoms and fandom culture as a whole. For more information about the show and the other show that I do, 17 Karat K-Pop, visit 17karatkpop.weebly.com. You can also go to 17karatkpop.weebly.com/howtostan for more specific information about this podcast. Enjoy the show. You are listening to How to Stan, episode 11, Fan Fiction. Last week on How to Stan, we talked about certain television show-based fandoms and how those fandoms actually have this reciprocal relationship that sometimes can last very long term with the producers, creators, writers, etc. who actually work on the show that they stan. Fans contribute ideas for the creators to use, tell them which characters they want to see go in certain directions or want to stop seeing certain characters go in certain directions. And aside from just creative input, fans sometimes even make physical merch of their own. They really take it upon themselves to willingly become these unpaid PR agents for the shows that they are such fans of. Similarly, that type of dynamic plays out between fans and authors sometimes when it comes to literary works and the fandom surrounding those, typically in the form of fan fiction, but there are also more extreme levels of showing your devotion to a book. And the best example of when the dynamic between fan fiction writers and the author of the original book can go awry comes from the Darkover fandom and what happened that really was a turning point in how people thought about if fan fiction is even ethical to do and how much people really should claim ownership over a story idea that they didn't originally write. The Darkover series was the set of novels and short stories of the science fiction and fantasy drama, basically about these space colonists who lost contact with Earth and then ended up crash landing on planet Darkover. So clearly there is a lot of ground there for fans to use to be extra creative with the fan fiction about what happens once they're on planet Darkover and they've lost contact with Earth. A lot of directions that could go in. So naturally, a lot of fan fiction writers started getting immersed in their own versions of the Darkover universe over time. And they actually were encouraged by the author at first. The author, Marion Zimmer Bradley, she published a lot. She published an average of about a book a year. By 1974, it was about a book a year. And this series was just a huge part of her life and, of course, the fans, because she kept giving them new content to add on to their new content. So it's just a constant stream of creativity both ways because she gave them ideas and they gave her ideas for each other's writing. And she really did encourage it. She would even give feedback on specific fans' writing. Sometimes if she really loved a piece of fan fiction, she would actually say this is officially part of the story universe, the literary canon for Darkover. And that was, of course, the crown jewel of compliments you could get in the fan fiction community. In 1988, she founded what was called Marion Zimmer Bradley's Fantasy Magazine, which was this quarterly publication that ran until 2000. So 1988 to 2000, it ran. And even before that, there were several decades where Bradley was constantly interacting with fans. So that's what makes this reciprocal relationship stand out so much as an example of how much that bond can form and then be severed eventually, which we will get to talking about eventually, but all to say that this Darkover world was a place where Bradley's mind was living in for decades along with the fans, and the length of their relationship and interactions is really astounding. Over time, a total of 12 anthologies of fan fiction ended up being published and considered officially part of the Darkover universe. And then this fan club sprung up called the Friends of Darkover that ended up publishing over time a total of 70 issues of a newsletter, over 12 story and poetry collections, several nonfiction essay compilations, zines about Darkover, and also zines about unrelated topics that they were just inspired to write once they realized they had an audience, poetry pamphlets, publications of all stripes, and all of the literary content produced by fan clubs like the Friends of Darkover was in such high demand that it needed to be reprinted after the first round of copies sold out. Bradley would give this fan club and other fan clubs special shoutouts on the back cover of her books, and it was really all love up until 1992. And that is the year when this Friends of Darkover group officially disbanded and could never be revived, really. The ultimate quote that I think really sums up what went wrong And what the underlying tension actually was this whole time was when Bradley said, quote, "I didn't invent Darkover, I discovered it." Really sums up how some authors suddenly view their place in their own story once fans have taken it upon themselves to be in charge of it. So in 1992, a fan named Gene Lamb wrote this fan fiction called Masks, and it was published in a fanzine that was not the one that Bradley edited. This was a different one called Moon Phases. Gene Lamb sent the story Masks to Bradley for feedback, but then Bradley wrote back saying that she didn't really love everything about it, but overall she thought it had potential. So she gave constructive criticism that fans had typically gotten used to from her, so she probably thought no hard feelings. But that clearly wasn't the case. The next book announcement, the book release that Bradley announced she was going to have for her Darkover series was a book called Contraband. That's why this moment in fan fiction is viewed as notoriously the Contraband incident. So Bradley was going to release this book called Contraband, and her preview of the upcoming release sounded really familiar to what Lamb had written. So Lamb threatened to sue her favorite author over this. And actually, because of the lawsuit and the negative press attention and the overall controversy that came because of the similarities between the author's work and the fan fiction she had read, the publisher ended up canceling its contract with Bradley. So Contraband was never actually published. Bradley was naturally stunned and hurt by that decision for her contract to get terminated, and that is when she really lost touch with the fandoms. She severed ties with the fandom. She didn't really edit their work anymore. She kind of dispersed the fandoms that she had helped been the centralizing force for. So now all these fandoms kind of just dispersed and dissolved gradually because she had been the anchor where they all came together online to communicate and share story ideas, and because she was no longer in that role, it all sort of fell apart. Bradley actually had indicated that she was going to use some of Lamb's fan fiction content in her own work before. She had even offered to pay Lamb for some of it, but Lamb said, quote, "I was unable to determine how much of the novel I wrote was going to be used. The offer consisted of a few $100s and a mention in a dedication, in exchange for my signing an agreement not to sue for copyright infringement. I then responded with a counteroffer which asked for even more money or a shared byline, unless the amount of my work being used could be clarified. If Ms. Bradley was going to use some ideas from the book, then she was free to do so without any cost. But if there was going to be a lot of my writings used, then I wanted to be compensated fairly." Bradley's rebuttal statement came in the form of a letter in an issue of the Darkover newsletter. She said, quote, "I'm sorry that things have come to this. I never wanted to have to keep a professional distance from my fans, and for more than 20 years I didn't need to. But I guess even the longest streak of good luck runs out eventually, and sometimes one bad apple does spoil the whole barrel. I regret having to give up a novel that I had already started work on, and I apologize to all of you who wanted to read it." Bradley's contract officially ended with DAW Books in 1993, and it was unclear how much of Contraband ever was actually written and ready to print by the time that everything fell apart. Bradley had already been writing it allegedly for 2 years. It was 2 years in the making when all of this happened, so it's not like it was just an idea floated out there. Fans really didn't feel sympathetic for Lamb. I guess that's putting it quite mildly, because even in that statement by Bradley saying, I guess one bad apple spoiled the whole carton, clearly the blame was placed at Lamb's feet for the end of Contraband's release schedule. And so fans really threw such intense backlash towards Lamb. They were so frustrated because they cited Lamb as not just the cause of Contraband not being released, but also for the fan clubs totally disbanding eventually, and for really turning off their favorite author away from the relationship. They were also very frustrated with the copyright legal issues that suddenly became more common for them, because now that this lawsuit situation had really drove a wrench in any good vibes that were between Bradley and her fans, Bradley was more willing to engage in legal action against them if they took her ideas. So it became really a war of ideas, of ownership over these ideas and characters. And then they really didn't have, without Bradley's cooperation in editing anymore, there was no explicit connection, there was no explicit approval on Bradley's side for fans to release their fan fiction into the world. So it would just ended up becoming a common legal mess, and they blamed Lamb for that precedent she set. So where are Darkover fans now? They used to actually continue to meet up at DarkoverCon up until 2013. That was a yearly convention meetup for them, also called the Darkover Grand Council meeting. Around 300 people would attend that every year and had been since the 70s. But by 2013, after the death of one of DarkoverCon's creators, the event just never got revived. And the Darkover newsletter is kind of no more, but its editor, Ian Sharp, encouraged fans to still write the fanfic, and then send that fanfiction to the place where Bradley kept her Darkover manuscripts, Boston University. So fans have continued to submit fanfiction to this archive in Boston University over the years. And so you could say the story's still alive, but in many ways it is not. And a lot of people blame one fan and one piece of fan fiction for all of the drama that followed. Which really brings up a lot of questions about the legitimacy of fan fiction and how messy that can get. From a moral standpoint, from a legal standpoint, all of that. So, what do other authors, aside from Bradley, think about fan fiction? First, let's talk about the authors who are strongly against it and why that is. First of all, some authors have expressed clear opposition to fanfiction because they view it as just really hard to keep the lines not from getting blurry. The legal risks are just too tricky and murky to even go there and let fans dabble a little bit in their own world. The author of the War God series, David Weber, said, quote, "A writer cannot allow the free use of his universe without risking the loss of his own rights too." Orson Scott Card, the author of Ender's Game, said, quote, "Fan fiction, while flattering, is also an attack on my means of livelihood. It is also a poor substitute for the writers inventing their own characters and situations. It does not help them as writers. It can easily harm me and those who care about my stories, and characters know that what I write is real and has authority, and what fans write is not and does not. So it's all pointless. I'd prefer simply to ignore it when it happens, but the way copyright law functions, I am told that I cannot ignore it." Now, this was a very strong response that got strong backlash from fans who felt very disillusioned with their previous favorite author. But in a follow-up statement attempting to clarify those remarks, Card said in June 2012 that maybe it's okay, basically, and held an official fanfiction contest where winners would be considered to have contributed to the official Ender's Game canon and professionally published in an Ender's Game anthology. A similar seemingly contradictory set of viewpoints was held by Lee Goldberg, who wrote Diagnosis Murder and some tie-in novels to the show Monk. Lee Goldberg basically said that there is a clear difference between writing what he called tie-in novels and writing actual fan fiction, viewing fan fiction as, quote, "the equivalent of stealing someone else's work and putting your own name on it," whereas tie-in novels, quote, "are the equivalent of being a freelance writer of an episode of a TV series." So Goldberg kind of viewed it as through a more long-term perspective of the implications of you adding to that universe and how much financially you were already getting the reciprocal affirmation of it contributing to the series. The second main argument that authors have is that they're just very protective over their work. They don't want fans infringing on the world they created. George R.R. Martin, from writing the Game of Thrones series, said, quote, "Every writer needs to learn to create his own characters, worlds, and settings. Using someone else's world is the lazy way out. My characters are my children. I don't want people making off with them, thank you, even people who say they love my children." Similarly, a protective stance was taken by Anne Rice, who said, quote, "I do not allow fan fiction. The characters are copyrighted. It upsets me terribly to even think about fan fiction with my characters. I advise my readers to write your own original stories with your own characters. It is absolutely essential that you respect my wishes." Some similar views have been shared by other authors like Stephenie Meyer, who wrote the Twilight novels, saying, quote, "People pour out so much energy and talent into the fanfiction, it makes me frustrated. I'm like, go write your own story, put them out there and get them published. That's what you should be doing. You should be working on your own book right now." Catherine Kerr, who wrote the Devery series, views fanfiction as displaying, quote, "a paucity of imagination," citing Wicked as a main example, thinking that even those types of spin-offs count as fanfiction, and that is just not creative and not really exercising your imagination as it should. My personal favorite, most interesting quote about being against fanfiction comes from the sci-fi novelist Charlie Stross, who said, quote, I am not a precious, sparkly unicorn who is obsessed with the purity of his characters. Rather, I'm a glittery and avaricious dragon who is jealous of a steaming pile of gold. If you do not steal the dragon's gold, the dragon will leave you alone. Offer to bring the dragon more gold, and the dragon will be your friend. So, a really cute way to basically say, don't take my money. So those are the main arguments against fanfiction, that it's just legally too murky of a territory, that fans who are interested in being writers should just focus on being more creative and making up their own stories entirely, rather than building off of work someone else started, and that the authors just feel so protective over the worlds they created, they don't want fans stepping over a line. On the flip side, a lot of authors are supportive of fanfiction and would counteract those arguments, first of all saying that they were fanfiction writers themselves when they were younger, and so they get the appeal of doing that, and they view any form of writing as just a great exercise in writing and just enhancing your skills. Even if they would prefer you maybe be more creative and use your own characters, it's still writing. Writing is writing, and that is just a special chance to grow in your confidence as a writer and your skills as a writer. Susan Brockman, who wrote the Tall, Dark, and Dangerous series and a bunch of romance novels and stuff, admits to writing Star Trek fanfiction when she was younger. Neil Gaiman wrote fanfiction, Sherlock Holmes fanfiction, that actually ended up winning him an award. Tessa Dare, who wrote the Stud Club trilogy, used to write Jane Austen fanfiction. Stephen King has been open about how his early works at least, drew very heavily from the books he read when he was younger and could be interpreted in some way as fanfiction. Author of Black Ships, Joe Graham, said, quote, as someone who's written fan fiction since I was 9 years old, I feel honored to have inspired that kind of thought and love. Similarly, another argument in support of fan fiction is that it's an honor that fans want to play in the universe you created, that fans want to add their own spin on something that you already had put some emotional time and investment in, and for them to add their own emotional time and energy into being in this fictional world that you created should be a source of pride. John Rogers, who wrote the book Leverage, said, quote, here's what it boils down to. You're telling me that in today's crowded media space, our show made someone love it so much they take time out of their own life to talk about it? B.R. Collins, author of A Trick of the Dark, said, quote, I'm amazed and thrilled that people care enough about my characters that they want them to go on living. James Bow, from the Unwritten Book series, that's what it's called, said, quote, I can only dream of the day when fan fiction written around my professional novels appears on the internet. To me, it would feel as though I've come full circle. Other authors not only view it as an honor when fans write fiction based on their characters, but they also view it as just their moral duty to let fans do what they want with those characters, viewing it as once they release a book, they have released the character into the world. So instead of taking this protective stance like this is my child that I created, they say, no, you're free to do what you want with it now. It's out in your hands now as a reader. Catherine Valente said, quote, when I signed that contract 3 years ago, I gave them to you with both hands and gladly. C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia series, responded to a fan letter asking if she could write fan fiction, saying, quote, I'm delighted to hear that you like the Narnian books. There's a map at the end of some of them in some editions, but why not do one yourself? And why not write stories for yourself to fill up the gaps in Narnian history? I've left you plenty of hints, especially where Lucy and the unicorn are talking. I feel I have done all I can. Jacqueline Lichtenberg said, quote, let fans play in your universe. Writing is about giving and sharing, not about possession and control. Lastly, Neil Gaiman said, quote, I think that all writing is useful for honing writing skills. I think you get better as a writer by writing, and whether that means that you're writing a singularly deep and moving novel about the pain or pleasure of modern existence, or you're writing /fiction, you're still putting one darn word after another and learning as a writer. Other authors maybe aren't really such a fan of fan fiction, but they also aren't incredibly opposed to it. They kind of put their hands up and say, what are we going to do about it now? As long as you don't cross a line, meaning you don't have R-rated content, especially among minor characters, and as long as you don't infringe on copyright and make money off of their idea, then they're fine with it. A lot of authors seem to have this don't ask, don't tell policy where it's fine, but just don't let the author have to see it. they'd rather not know about the fan fiction you're creating, but you are free to do so on your own time. A lot of authors have even said that you can do this, but when you do that, I'm not going to read it because I don't want to even be accused of stealing your story idea. For example, Tess Gerritsen, who wrote the Rizzolian Isles novels, said, quote, "I am absolutely not reading any of these fan fiction stories because I don't want to ever be accused of stealing someone's story idea." Likewise, Leigh Bardugo, who wrote Six of Crows and Wonder Woman Warbringer, said, quote, "I've had a few people send me fan fictions, and unfortunately, I've had to decline reading them. I will admit to being incredibly curious, but until the trilogy is published, and maybe even after, I just don't want other narratives in my head." Some artists even uplift fan fiction by posting links to it on their official website or having a whole section of their website where fan fiction can be posted. Some authors like Scott Cohen and John Scalzi have written open letters welcoming fan fiction and clarifying absolutely 100% go ahead, you have my complete transparent approval. Meg Cabot actually has a whole forum space on her official website where fan fiction can be posted. And other authors have actually hosted their own contests for fan fiction, like the author of Ender's Game. So even the authors that seemingly were against the concept, sometimes they will allow it. Some authors used to be opposed to or in favor of fan fiction, but totally flipped their perspective on it over time. For example, Jasper Fforde, who wrote Thursday Next, said, quote, "After speaking to many fan fictioneers and understanding the genre a little better, I've modified my opinion. The bottom line is that all creative writing is good, wherever it is, whoever it is, and whatever the subject. And nobody should attempt either consciously or unconsciously to discourage those who wish to express themselves." Anne McCaffrey, who wrote Dragon Riders of Pern, used to have an official policy against fan fiction in the 90s and the early 2000s, but now she allows for a little more leeway, and fans can write some fan fiction. It just has to be for non-commercial use. Anne Rice was very, very known for being anti-fan fiction, but in 2012, she indicated now that she's a little more open to it. She just ignores it, so it's fine as long as you don't bring it up to her. And then in 2013, she commented, quote, "It's been very easy to avoid reading any, so live and let live. If I were a young writer, I'd want to own my ideas, but maybe fan fiction is a transitional phase. Whatever gets you there, gets you there." George R.R. Martin, who wrote Game of Thrones, is of the similar mindset where he's still pretty much against fan fiction, but says, quote, "People can do whatever they want for their own personal amusement, so long as they don't send it to me." Ultimately, it seems fine with a lot of authors if you are aware of and respect their boundaries when it comes to how much you engage in the fictional world they created. Lev Grossman had a very interesting argument that seemed to be an implied argument in favor of fan fiction, saying, quote, "Shakespeare didn't invent Hamlet and King Lear, he plucked them from historical and literary sources. Writers weren't the originators of the stories they told, they were just the temporary curators of them. Real creation was something the gods did." There is a lot of merit to the argument that no story is really original, because, like Grossman said, dating back to the Greek gods and their myths, allegedly, they passed those down generations through word of mouth and altered the definitions like a game of telephone over time. And so every writer has just been the temporary curator of a piece of work. And Shakespeare didn't come up with a lot of original ideas. He really did take plots and characters from past storytelling and adjusted them to his own unique story. So you could argue everyone dating back to Shakespeare and earlier was engaged in fan fiction of some form or another. It just wasn't called that. Michael Chabon, who wrote Wonder Boys and many other books, said, quote, "All literature is fan fiction. Through parody and pastiche, allusion and homage, retelling and reimagining the stories that were told before us and that we have come of age, all novels are sequels. Influence is bliss." So is any story truly an original story? Walter Benjamin, who wrote this 1935 essay that is very well known among literary scholars, is called The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And Benjamin basically argues that the true authenticity of a work has become more and more difficult to define over time because we need to totally reconceptualize how we think about authenticity in today's day and age. And that the ability to make copies of art over time have really expanded and led to a devaluation of the original version of a piece. So he basically he argues that we need to totally rethink how we view an original piece of work and how we view, I guess you could say, spin-offs of that work. Suddenly, works of art that were considered in the same class and viewed with the same level of prestige were no longer that way. Even though this was back in 1935, he was aware of those changes in access to printing and making books and things like that, and of course with technology that's been exacerbated, to say the least. So a copy of a copy of a copy is what was happening, and so he argued that it brings into question what the original was even like anymore, and let's rethink how we think about that, which is super relevant today, thinking about all of the reboots and spin-offs that keep coming out, and the remakes of old stories. So then you've got to argue, well, was that even the original story? Because now are we at the point where this movie is a spin-off of a spin-off of a spin-off, or is it all just a retelling of the same story? How do we think about it? We need to reframe that. A good example is like with Cinderella remakes. We've had a bajillion of those, and another one just finished production actually this year. So was this latest Cinderella movie that was just filmed a spin-off of a spin-off of a spin-off, etc.? Or is it just a retelling of a classic story? How should we frame this? Because then when we keep using the word spin-off, eventually it's kind of losing its meaning and devaluing the new piece of work. So arguably, even our movies and plays are fan fiction, you could argue, these days, and that we're all just fans of pop culture that we keep reusing in ways that we appreciate. Take West Side Story. That story was overtly based on Romeo and Juliet's storyline, but it's still such a beloved show. And it isn't viewed as just derivative and taking away from Romeo and Juliet's power. It's viewed as just its own thing, even though it technically was not an original idea. Also, a lot of Disney movies that are so beloved, even the old school cartoon Disney movies, even those were not actually original ideas. They came from other ideas that Disney then bought the rights to make their own cartoon version of. We're going to talk about some more modern versions of fan fiction and this whole debate about it, including 50 Shades of Grey and After and other movies and franchises you may not have realized were fan fiction at all, but are pretty much fan fiction, and they match the criteria for that. We're going to debate that after the break. The quickest, most G-rated recap I can give you of the 50 Shades of Grey franchise: it was a book series written by E.L. James that was published at first as just an ebook by the small Australian publisher in May of 2011. And then 50 Shades Darker, the sequel, came out officially September of 2011. Then 50 Shades Freed came out in January 2012, and the trilogy was complete. In February of 2012, E.L. James signed with this international publisher, and her stories became the top-selling Kindle e-reader books of all time, very soon after that deal was signed. The book has been translated into dozens of languages. Now over 70 million copies have been sold worldwide, not just on ebooks, but now it's a physical book, of course. The films started coming out in 2015. She had this From Christian Grey Perspective book that came out in June of 2015. And 100 million copies had been sold worldwide by February of 2014. Also, the book spent 100 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. It, needless to say, became this phenomenon. James's stories were originally Twilight fan fiction. Not an exaggeration to say that or assume that that is actually confirmed, that she wrote Twilight fan fiction and repurposed it as 50 Shades of Grey. So that's why, part of the reason why this was such a cultural moment for so many people and became so popular, because 50 Shades of Grey was viewed as the catalyst for normalizing and mainstreaming, for lack of a better term, fan fiction. Not as this side thing, but as a thing that could be legitimized as part of pop culture history. The fan fiction version of this story was called Master of the Universe, and that was posted to this fan fiction website in 2009 when James wrote under this pen name Snow Queen's Ice Dragon. And under Snow Queen's Ice Dragon, she wrote about this fanfiction where Bella and Edward were together, but Bella was turned into a high school character, from a high school character to a university student, and Edward, instead of being a vampire, was just this human, this wealthy corporate executive. Then the Jacob character was replaced with this guy named Jose, who didn't really speak much Spanish, except he kept saying Dos mio at points, but that was about it. So she really kind of changed the characters to her liking. Her husband actually served as the editor of these stories, and she constantly took into account fanfiction reader feedback as she added to this Master of the Universe story. Then in 2011, she changed the characters' names, so Bella became Anastasia Steele, and Edward became Christian Grey. Despite the immense global popularity of the 50 Shades franchise, the movies got 4.1 out of 10 on IMDb and 25% on Rotten Tomatoes. They definitely were panned by the critics immensely and viewed as just not quality cinema in any way, not a real quality storytelling, but fans still loved it. And a similar thing happened with The Mortal Instruments, which got a 13% on Rotten Tomatoes and 5.9 out of 10 on IMDb. Critics viewed The Mortal Instruments as, quote, an almost random collection of sexy supernatural teen signifiers, a checklist of stuff that sells young adult fantasy fiction. One reviewer said it, quote, plays like a copy of a copy until motivations and storylines become obscured and nonsensical. It was just viewed as way too derivative. The Mortal Instruments was originally fan fiction for the Harry Potter world, written by Cassandra Clare. She had written this, and it was called the Draco Trilogy, about Draco Malfoy from Harry Potter. It was a fan fiction story collection about this girl named Clary, who was pretty much identically like Ginny Weasley, and Clary learned she's this shadow hunter, and who she was hidden away by her human mom from the human world, basically. So a lot like the premise of Harry Potter being hidden from the wizarding world. And Clary was looking to find her lost mom alongside this fellow shadow hunter named Jace, who is basically Draco Malfoy. The search that they went on was for these mortal instruments. There were 3 mortal instruments they had to find in order to find her mom, and that's a lot like in Harry Potter, they search for the 3 Deathly Hallows in a way, and those are a big part of their story. So a lot of plot elements were still there in the published version of Mortal Instruments. And it's not just books and movies that become sources of fan fiction that fans may not even realize was fan fiction for something else. This is also the case even with boy band fan fiction, which is the case with the movie After. The movie After is based on a book by an author who had written One Direction fan fiction, and then that became the plot of the book and then the movie. The story is basically about this college student named Tessa Yun who falls in love with this bad boy, Hardin Scott. Hardin Scott, aka HS, same initials as Harry Styles from One Direction, no coincidence there. There's also a band member in One Direction and a guy in the story with the same name, Liam, who is this clean-cut character who Tessa is friends with in the book. The author Anna Todd had written this fan fiction where this girl Tessa falls in love with Harry Styles to Wattpad in 2013, and that ended up being read over 1 billion times before 2015. And 80 chapters ended up being written eventually through this saga on Wattpad before the story was even turned into a 5-part book series. So Anna Todd actually wrote the fan fiction on Wattpad for a long time before it even turned into a book series for her, and now it is a movie franchise that has sequels in the works. Despite being popular enough to get sequel movies, again, the critics panned this release widely. It got a 5.3 out of 10 on IMDb, and the first movie also got a 19% on Rotten Tomatoes. Overall, the critics viewed it as very predictable and generic about this teen romance, and just viewed it as ultimately unrealistic and far-fetched, hard to get into and find the characters relatable or interesting and worth rooting for. The AV Club said it's, quote, a lifeless slog of thinly written cliches. First Post said it's, quote, shielded from common sense. And the LA Times said it's, quote, characters act illogically as though written by someone who napped through most of Intro to Psych and skipped English 101 altogether. My thoughts on fanfiction and when fanfiction goes too far have to do with taking a few different arguments into account combined. So first of all, I would like to point out the arbitrary nature in general of copyright law. It's not like that was just a natural part of humanity to have that copyright set of standards. That was man-made, and therefore it could be flawed or it could be something that at least needs revisions. Actually, intellectual property rights didn't really come up at all until the 18th century. The first British copyright law passed in 1709, and the first international agreement on copyright laws wasn't set up until 1886. In addition to intellectual property discussions, fandoms really emerged thanks to increased literacy rates worldwide, increased public education, urbanization that led to a decline in the cost of paper and printing and other materials needed. There were a lot of reasons why suddenly it was easier to actually physically write these stories, and so that brought up this debate. This debate was not just a natural part of writing, it really was due to these social and cultural factors. Referencing this history is this group by and for fan fiction writers called the Organization for Transformative Works, aka OTW. They lobby in favor of a flexible interpretation of copyright law, saying, quote, "Copyright is intended to protect the creator's right to profit from her work for a period of time to encourage creative endeavor and the widespread sharing of knowledge. But this does not preclude the right of others to respond to the original work, either with critical commentary, parody, or, we believe, transformative works. Transformative works are creative works about characters or settings created by fans of the original work, rather than by the original creators. A transformative use is one that, in the words of the U.S. Supreme Court, adds something new with a further purpose or different character, altering the source with new expression, meaning, or message." A story from Voldemort's perspective is transformative. So is a story about a pop star that illustrates something about current attitudes towards celebrity or sexuality. Basically, this organization argues that fan fiction is according to the U.S. Supreme Court's laying out of the argument, totally legal and fine because it is transformative works. Branding it as transformative works as opposed to fan fiction enhances the fact that they are just drawing inspiration from other works that came before them, which is like a lot of our media, like I said, a lot of it just keeps recycling old stories, and is there ever really truly a new original story? So that is a legal argument I find convincing, but from a sociological standpoint, I like to think about the construction of ownership and our concept of ownership in a society over time, and how a lot of it has to do with the implicit contract. So science fiction author Larry Niven described readers basically as, quote, "entitled to be entertained, instructed, amused, maybe all three. If he quits in the middle or puts the book down feeling that his time has been wasted, you're in violation of that implicit contract." Basically saying that audiences expect that in exchange for giving you time, attention, and sometimes money for reading your work, they are owed something in return. They are owed enjoyment or education or something out of your work in a way that matches their expectations. And if it doesn't, then that implicit contract between authors and readers was violated, and therefore the readers have this moral right to change the story as they see fit to fulfill that need that you did not. One could further elaborate on that thought by arguing that without the fans, authors wouldn't be there and wouldn't be able to have anyone invested in time, energy, or money into their work if there weren't for that fan base. So the fans do deserve even more maybe than a little bit of entertainment or amusement or education. Maybe they do deserve to have more tools at their disposal and more freedom to add on to your story because they gave you so much, and then you can give them more freedoms in exchange. My first main argument in defense of fan fiction has to do with the legal aspect. My second main argument has to do with the sociological aspect and how we construct concepts like ownership over an idea, based on the fact that we constantly are remaking ideas in pop culture. That's what pop culture often is, a great big remake. My third out of four main arguments has to do with the financial and economic aspect of this whole world. This scholar, Terra Nova, whose work I will link to on my site, as I always do with the studies and scholarly articles I reference during my episodes, views fan labor as deserving of a lot of compensation and becoming increasingly needed and relied upon because of a capitalist society. Because capitalism doesn't just require in a society that an idea gets updated, but that new problems form so that we can also make solutions for them. So, in other words, the argument is that due to the nature of capitalism, the goal is to constantly solve problems while still creating new problems, because then you have more problems to keep solving. If you kept solving every problem without making new problems and new inventions with other problems to eventually fix, then eventually it would come to an end, and that cannot happen with an economic model focused on continuous growth as opposed to any form of just stability in terms of profits. Terranova said, quote, "It is not enough to produce a good website. You need to update it continuously to maintain interest in it and fight off obsolescence." And he views this quote-unquote digital economy as providing a chance to really stop and redefine fan production and labor, saying, quote, "The digital economy is an important area of experimentation with value, and free cultural labor is about specific forms of production, but it is also about forms of labor we do not immediately recognize as such. Chat, real-life stories, mailing lists, amateur newsletters, and so on. These types of cultural and technical labor are not produced by capitalism in any direct cause and effect fashion. That is, they have not developed simply as an answer to the economic needs of capital." The implication here is basically that copyright feuds between fans and the original creators of certain media will evolve and look different going forward because we can use this new digital economy that's been born as a reset button, as a chance to stop and reflect on how we need to redefine what fan labor looks like and what it counts as actual labor, and then that can alter, in turn, like a domino effect, how we define fan fiction, how we define ownership over ideas, how we define compensation for putting those ideas into the world, all of that. So the main financial argument, economic model argument that makes fan fiction exist in society in the way that makes the most sense is arguing for the ability to create fan fiction because that is in line with what the economic model requires. It requires constant updates to a concept. And not only that, but new forms. So for example, books about vampires like Twilight do not just require solving all the cliches you see there by maybe making a story that you think steps out of those cliches, but it also requires making a book like 50 Shades of Grey that further adds complications and problematic aspects in some people's minds to this original story, so that then people might make 50 Shades of Grey spin-offs, then people might make spin-offs of those spin-offs, and it needs to keep branching out as opposed to just being a linear progression. The ideal is for constant growth as opposed to just a constant straight line of an idea moving forward, if that makes sense. It needs to constantly be built upon, and fan fiction is a tool for building upon an idea. Lastly, from a social perspective, just in terms of social health, this remix culture that, as some scholars describe it, is worth investing in and allowing to thrive. Remix culture is what lets stories thrive. It allows an author's original work to continue to have relevancy and interest over time. And remix culture is what ultimately could just not even have a term, but just be culture these days. It's all retooling original ideas to ends that you find fulfill your own needs, whether it's in your social circle, whether it's changing a character so that you feel more represented, whether it's changing a plot point to satisfy previously unsatisfied readers who felt like they did not reach the ideals of the implicit contract between them and the authors. It's just remix culture fulfills a lot of social needs and then can add a sense of satisfaction to readers. And if readers are more satisfied with what the work is or what they've changed about it, then that satisfaction motivates them to write more, to read more, to share ideas more, keeping the story alive to help the authors, but also it ends up helping them grow as writers and readers and critical thinkers as well. Allowing fans to personalize their experience with a text is what remix culture and fan fiction is all about. Allowing them to reappropriate it to their own emotional and social needs is quite cathartic. Fans can also then find a community through these online affinity spaces where they can share ideas with people who validate their writing. And many studies, some of which I will link on my website as always, do show connections between fan fiction or just in general letting writers have more freedom with what they get to write and increased self-esteem in their writing, increased belief that they are good writers, and overall just increased actual writing skills, because the more you write, the better you can get at it. And so any way you write can be very positive in terms of your skills. Ian Jamieson probably has my favorite quote about this whole argument. Fanfiction invites readers collectively and collaboratively to join in. Clicking on a fanfiction link is like joining a perpetual online writing and reading party, a party that celebrates, consumes, and jubilantly recreates a loved work. As a book lover myself, I have so many memories of the first time I read a book that really struck me, and how much I loved spending hours escaping into that literary world, and imagine being able to recreate that exciting feeling by going online and seeing other people around the world talking about that same book, or adding their own spin to that same story, getting permission to live in that literary world longer. Such a special treat to do that. And so that is why I have to come out on the side in defense of fan fiction writing in any form, because it is a way to fulfill your own needs as well as others simultaneously, because you find that community talking about the book and keeping that free publicity alive for your favorite author as well. There's this book called The Female Complaint by Laura Berlant, and it's a book that basically describes this archive of women's culture. Basically, it talks about how what is labeled as women's media, like 50 Shades of Grey, fulfills unique purposes in women's lives because they need to be fulfilled, those needs, in a certain way that is particular to women given the patriarchal societies we live in. And it basically goes on to say that we are constantly on this quote-unquote feminine project, and that certain types of stories just are a great tool that enables women to feel like certain feelings are validated, like certain ways of thinking and being are allowed when they wouldn't normally otherwise. And I'm not going to say what I think about the 50 Shades of Grey books or movies or any of that. I'm frankly not super informed on it all and don't really care to be. It's not my thing. But the argument here is not really even in defense of or against the books either, but just about in defense of the actual fans and why they might like it, to open people's minds to why they like it as opposed to just judging people for liking it. And you may think that those books are just in general a terrible influence on women and just promotes this submission, but this author argues, quote, "From these archives, women can choose content that helps them understand, tolerate, criticize, or oppose the feminine project." So she writes about the feminine project as this concept of how fan fiction and original, quote-unquote original works just give fans the ability to learn more about themselves, to internalize the stories, to self-reflect, and decide if the story should be critiqued or praised or whatever. And so either way, it is a useful tool to have in the world. It's basically a promotion of books and publications overall, and just that freedom to read whatever you want, because then that can shape who you are. And even if it seems like it'll influence you for the worst, it might actually influence you for the better, because it allows you to think about what you don't want to be like or what story you don't want to see play out in your real life. And similar to just reading a bad book or a bad piece of fan fiction, it may seem like a waste of time, but just that access to read it is a way where you can better understand where you would take the story in a different direction, and that gets your creative juices flowing, which is ultimately what fan fiction does and is all about. We will talk in a future episode about other literary and book series specific fandoms like the Hunger Games and stuff in future episodes of How to Stan, and we will revisit some of the details of this conversation about what is considered fan fiction and should 50 Shades of Grey even still be considered fan fiction. We will look at arguments for and against that in a future episode. But for now, I encourage you to just reflect on these messy dynamics where there's not really a clear-cut argument that is 100% ideal or 100% not ideal. The Darkover story, the contraband incident as it's called, is a prime example of how authors and fan fiction writers can really, it can be detrimental to the storyline, but it can also allow the storyline to flourish for a certain amount of time. But it's all about when that implicit contract between authors and fans has been violated, and being more aware of that contract and how authors review and reconsider the definition of that contract over time is key to keeping that relationship alive and well between authors and fans. Again, we will reflect on all this more in a future episode, but I'll leave you with those thoughts to think about and reflect on today. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next week. And if you listen to my other podcast, 17 Karat K-Pop, my quick housekeeping note is just that my episodes of 17 Karat K-Pop this week will be a little later than usual, just because I have some exciting things for the show I'm working on that will happen Monday, and so I want to have those episodes edited and published until later than expected, so just hold tight, but I've got a lot of content for that show coming as well. As for How to Stand, I'll be back next Sunday as usual. Thank you for listening.